Thank you so much for being here for this session. Um, uh, Today we're talking about a very interesting topic about the role of vernacular in the Indian contemporary design language. And we are here to kind of talk about what the role of the vernacular design is in that. Shabnam, your interior spaces are vibrant, eclectic, always soaked in influences from the country's heritage. You capture the artisanal beauty that India offers in your very contemporary and modern homes. Sandeep, your work feels so generous, keeping the sun, the wind in mind. It's joyful with courtyards and water bodies and rooted in materials and colors from the region. Verendra, although prima facie work, Matra's work is not vernacular, but there's a fundamental affinity and cognizance of context. So I'd like to begin this conversation with a very open and a general question about what, according to you all, is vernacular design. All of us, of course there's a definition, but all of us understand it and use it in our work in different ways. So can I start with you, Shabnam, that in your work, what is it, what do you kind of understand and take in as vernacular design?
So, vernacular refers to, as a meaning, the use of traditional materials or techniques or craft which are very specific to a region. What happens is that in today's modern living, when you talk about vernacular in context to design, in today's modern living, the kind of homes we create at the studio, which are luxury homes, you try to use vernacular to give context to a person's roots as to where they come from. And though we all live very, very hectic modern lives, but you somehow end up eating dal chawal most of the time. That's because that's your comfort. So even while we create homes that might be modern India, vernacular for our studio is about giving that context, creating the roots and the cultural relevance to the people who inhabitate the homes.
Sandeep, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so, our understanding of vernacular is something that, communities, it's not an individual designer's response, but vernacular is always a community's response over maybe generations to their survival needs with certain resources. And I find it over a period of time through trial and error. They have kind of arrived at a system of building or a system of using materials. So I think there's a lot of value today to kind of look back at vernacular design. I think we've probably looked back at it for about 25 years of practice, where we've kind of looked at certain concepts in vernacular design. Rather than elements of vernacular, I would go back to concepts of vernacular and actually look at concepts and interpret it in a contemporary design vocabulary. Of course, we've used elements too. We've looked at, we live in Bangalore, and we've looked at the houses and the villages around in Bangalore area, which have got all the slope roofs. I think Kate was showing the Albuquerque, the tile factory. So those were the Mangalore tiles. Actually, it came in the 1860s through German missionaries, those tiles. And then in the colonial time, all colonial buildings were built with those tiles. So we took cues from maybe some of the buildings we were restoring from there, and we said, this is a sensible material to use, clay. Slope roofs are sensible for the rainfall, they're good insulation, etc., etc. And we then started using it in our projects and in our houses. So, that's one example, the Sadar Ali stone on which our city is built. That's the granite on which it's the bedrock of what our city is built. So we started using that. So what I'm trying to say is that we, of course, use elements, but I think the more powerful idea in my mind always, because I worked with Charles Correa and I got exposed to Jeffrey Bava in my very early years, starting off practice, these architects had already developed a kit of parts of a contemporary design language using the vernacular. And that kind of inspired us to do courtyard homes, to do homes which are open to the sky. And why were we doing this? Because the climate demanded it. And when we look back at that, I mean, today when you look at the climate, the crisis that we're in, and a depleting planet, it makes sense to use those passive design strategies. So we've been doing courtyard houses for 25 years, but today I would continue to do them again and again because of the cross ventilation, because of the light that you get in, because you're kind of not mechanically kind of overloading your building. It just came naturally because it made sense, and to use vernacular concepts.
Well, it's very good to hear. You just said that, lately and over the past few years, you've seen much more of this particular kind of influx and, people coming and having those kind of requests. I would talk to you about this. We would come back to that particular part of the conversation a little later, but we'd like to pick that point up a little later.
But I'd like to say one more thing.
Yeah.
You said something about Virendra's work, which you said is not vernacular. And I would disagree. I would disagree with that. Because I think there is a strong vernacular in his work too. I mean, if you look at, I was looking at his house in Udaipur. It is, he's taken concepts of the Chhatri. It's very rooted in Vastu. These are all vernacular aspects.
Yeah, I'd said
but it is, no, I was just reflecting back to some of his work. So
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I thought to add that I'm the black sheep here, but he did it well. I mean, he's advocated something that sometimes I forget to realize myself. But what I have done to understand the vernacular versus the non-vernacular, I thought I will put some opposites together that may highlight what vernacular means, I think, to nearly all of us. Because I think when you talk about vernacular, you suddenly think of the sloping roof. I don't know why I do that. And then you are reminded when you go back to your childhood, the first sketch that, and I think is ubiquitous, that the first sketch that every child, without being trained, does about a house, the sketch of the house, is a sloping roof. Christopher Alexander talks about it. I don't remember exactly why that happens. Deep down, there must be in the collective memory, the house must be there that is transferred then from generation to generation. So the vernacular has something about inherent qualities that are passed on. So the idea of the time in the vernacular is different than the non-vernacular, which could be the international, which could be the formal, and we know that from languages. The vernacular languages are languages that are spoken in certain regions, spoken by common people in inverted commas, because we have then the architects or the designers from the field of the international or the formal education who speak a different language. It's a constructed language. I feel similarly, vernacular is a non-constructed language, a folk language, while in all design aspects, which weave in a way the rituals that are somehow integral to a community. So for me, that's very, very important, that there's a community and the community finds a language which is commonly spoken, which is but also not abstract in the sense that it alienates the community. When I look the other side, so I have here probably the collective, which is familiar. The other side, I have the unfamiliar. The unfamiliar is the non-vernacular, the alienation. We have that with Corbusier, and I think Mrs. Malone mentioned that they traveled to Chandigarh. It blows everybody's mind when you travel there, but that's formal architecture. And I think in our work, a lot of concrete is used. I think more than any other private building I've seen lately, except Matharu's. They do also a lot of concrete. But I agree there a bit with Sandeep. It's not about the visible vernacular in our work. It's actually the conceptual vernacular in our work, which certainly, and that sets the vernacular, the traditional vernacular, against the formal vernacular. I may call it a formal vernacular. It is that the mind is used here strongly in the formal vernacular, while in the vernacular, original vernacular, there's body and mind. We saw in the works of ceramic and the other collection across India that these things can't be obtained through the mind only. And most of our education is to do with mind, lately, 21st century, 20th century, while the body takes a backseat. And I will come probably later to these aspects that I think are very crucial in the future also. How much do I suppress my body when we come to AI? How much do we emphasize on the mind? So I think we'll talk more about these aspects.
I do want to just kind of probe you a little bit about, your practice and the vernacular aspect of it. It's very interesting in terms of, what you're saying about, that side of the mind, and that's the approach that you're taking. Is there a little bit more you can kind of elaborate in terms of how is it that you approach your work, which is vernacular?
Yeah, I mean, lately we have realized few things that are very important. One realization is that there's music in architecture and in any objects that you may like.
I'll just add one more line. I mean, what you're saying is reminding me of, if you look at Japanese architect, if you look at Tadao Ando's work, for example, it's unmistakably Japanese. But there is, what is that? There is a spirit. There's a spirit of haiku, or what he calls there's a stillness to his work. There's a silence to the work, which is not in elements per se, but there is something, you go into that building, you go into any Ando project, and you know that it is steeped, there's a cultural memory, it's steeped in Japanese culture, there is a lot of vernacular influences, but it doesn't come out in terms of form, it comes out in terms of spirit.
Yeah. So tradition and cultural kind of history, that informing of tradition and cultural history in these kind of very subtle forms is yes, no, I absolutely kind of agree with what you're saying. Shabnam, if I can just bring that question to you, in your body of work, you of course are doing these fantastic homes and all the interiors and all of that, but it's completely influenced by your love for different things, across the country. Can you just elaborate a little bit of that in terms of what part of your body of work is vernacular? You use jalis, you use different kind of floors, all of those kind of things that happen. Can you just elaborate for everybody? What is it that you love kind of bringing in, and why you do that?
So firstly, as an interior design studio, our approach is very different from, say, architecturally when you look at a project, because we get a shell. And when you're doing interiors, we are not a studio that's screaming we are vernacular, because we get all kinds of clients, and we get clients, fortunately we attract clients who are like-minded to the practice, but at the same time, they don't want an arty khadi home. They still want a home that's luxurious, that kind of fits with their lifestyle. I think at that point, it becomes very imperative as a studio to ensure that we balance their lifestyle and we still embody the project with the belief system of like what we were discussing, context to culture, context to traditions, which is what we try to do in Elements. And I think when we do that, for example, when we do a powder bathroom, like we did this powder bathroom, which was a charcoal jet black powder bathroom, and we used teakri as a craft. But we did not use it in its traditional form. We actually used it sprinkled all across the dome to be like a night sky. And what happens is that when you take crafts or materiality and you infuse your context to the craft being modern still, whether you do it in a motif and you make sure that the traditional motif has a modern context so it stays relevant in today's design language. And that's also a problem, that a lot of the crafts are becoming redundant because they haven't been able to evolve and keep up from a lifestyle perspective or from how design is perceived today. They are outdated. And I think that's a very big change that is happening across design studios, where they are giving this new lease of life to our traditional crafts. And that's typically how we would embody this work. Like, we've taken a traditional Suzani fabric and we would, wrap it around a very modern vineyard staircase, which is made out of steel. But the Suzani is what kind of juxtaposes against it. And I think that's how we try to get in a bit of culture and context through our work.
Sure.
Actually, when I look at Shabnam's work, I mean, apart from the various elements, and I know you're bringing in craft and you're bringing all these, vernacular, traditional elements into a contemporary home, I think what strikes me the most is her use of color, which is so saturated. And I think that is, again, something in the memory that you're working in a particular context. That's the color that we see. And I think she's not afraid to use saturated, deep, exciting colors that we see all around us, And I think that's so much, to do with the vernacular.
Are there limitations? We've been talking also subtly about challenges. I want to kind of explore that a little bit in terms of, now, are there limitations when incorporating vernacular elements, and how do these challenges affect the creation of contemporary modern homes that people might want, or spaces that need to be created with, these elements that need to come through? Can I ask you this first?
Yes, I definitely think there are challenges. The challenges are more to do with, a vernacular is so sublime that it's, like we rightly discussed, it's part of what that space needs to be. It cannot be forced. And to get the right materiality, to have the materiality talk to each other, especially in cities. We do a lot of work in metros. And at that point, what happens is that even when you're trying to be sustainable and people want luxury homes, they want vernacular, but they want vernacular to be limited or vernacular to become luxurious. It can't be construed as a home that's too arty or too traditional or too ethnic. So I think for us as a studio, the challenge we face is how do you still give that context? How do you still maintain local materiality and yet introduce the craft, or yet plus the cost factor, plus connecting with master craftsmen and artisans? That's another factor which a lot of them are becoming more and more contextual, simply because there's a lot of young practices that are now reinventing our crafts, which again, I know we'll talk about that, but that's a big wave that we see happening. But yes, there are challenges. They are more to do with changing people's mindsets. It's like buying mass-produced fashion and buying slow living individual handmade pieces. So I think for us, that's one of the big challenges that we face in terms of introducing subtle vernacular materials.
Right. And Sandeep, do you see that? Is there a challenge in terms of?
Yes, for sure. I think you touched on the idea of slow, there's this slow food movement. I think we are fortunate enough, Amrish and I talk about this very often, is that in our homes we are a little bit blessed because there is time on our hands. But we are living in an age of impatience. So, there's impatience and then there's cost. Fortunately, when you're doing luxury homes, the cost factor doesn't come in that much. But there is a certain amount of patience which is there, which we are able to we are able to experiment with craftspeople or with the laborers or masons, and we are able to kind of do things in a slightly more determined way. But there's always a race to, otherwise in commercial projects, to there's time, cost, there's prefabrication, there's globalization, I'll tell you a little story about, there's a friend of mine who's got a resort in Himachal. We've been to his resort in Manali, and he's built the entire resort out of the Kathkuni Himachal architecture. That is that was the vernacular architecture of the region, which was all built with stone and deodar wood from the forest. Now, for ages and for centuries, they were building because it was freely available material. So they were building these beautiful homes, and it was fantastic for that seismic zone, for the earthquakes. Now what has happened is that no one is building in that material anymore. So all that beautiful architecture, he's built a resort. So he's built these homes out of that because it's so important to kind of hold on to that tradition. But no kind of person in a village will opt for that because the cost of the home built in stone and wood is 3 times the cost of an RCC structure. It takes twice as long to build. So I think we've got to arrive at a neo-vernacular. We've got to arrive at concepts of construction which are intelligent, which work with those seismic zones. But how do you replace? All the forests got replaced. He was telling me that after the colonial times, because all forests got under the forest department. So it's not that the average person in a village has access to the forest or the wood in the forest or the deodar wood. So now without wood, how does that Kathkuni, that is just going to die, right? So this is the dilemma in a lot of regions, is that there's the availability of those resources is not there. We are in climate change. With climate change, you've got to actually reinvent the vernacular. We have to take the intelligent concepts from that building method, but come out with new materials.
Yeah. So I'm just jumping a little bit just because of what you were talking about. You know, this challenge of materials and markets. That is, there's that mismatch that you're talking about. Virendra, would you like to kind of elaborate a little bit? Because when we were talking earlier, this is, as Sandeep is also saying, you know, the cost of what you want to use is, it's not affordable. Would you like to throw a bit of light on this particular situation?
Yeah. I think there is a kind of symbiotic relationship between the availability of material on one hand, and on the other side, the availability of manpower or human power. So both actually belong to a certain ecosystem. The traditional market for a vernacular building and enterprise was certainly very tight, very regionally defined, and very frugal also. I mean, we did have a handful of materials that were iterated upon, and I think partly that's the beauty also in the vernacular, that the the number of materials that are being deployed in making a building is very limited, extremely limited. Thus, it gives you, but also, or to the craftsman, the possibility of working on it, iterating on it. Today, architects generally, I try to stay away, I must tell you honestly, therefore I try to fix only on concrete, which is available all across the world. Now, you can criticize concrete is not sustainable, concrete has huge carbon footprint in the production. But what is interesting about concrete, that it has pushed now the limits of damage to an extent that today, I don't know her name, but she's developed the green concrete. That's the latest. It's a great news for people like me who work with concrete. And the equipment that is used to make green concrete is completely the same as the traditional concrete. The difference is only that you're not clinkering at high temperature, Portland cement and all those things. But what you are using is earth. So we will see, Europe certainly would be faster in developing these markets, so will US also. India certainly has more diversity, so it takes a little more time. But JK, I'm not promoting anybody here, but say some cement manufacturers have started doing already green concrete. So in the next 5 years, we'll see a lot of change in the market. And I find that always very important. You have to reach a criticality in your work to improve it further. And so is the market. I mean, we see when we go outside into different stalls, there has been always an evolution in developing certain components, certain ideas that are driven by the present situation, which can be now the ecological situation, or it could be the availability in villages and so on. So there's a lot of ingenuity that is working simultaneously to circumvent these bottlenecks. That's how I...
Believe it or not, we are out of time and we are just through half of what we wanted to discuss. So, but I will, one important question that I do want to ask all of you, and we don't know if we'll have time for questions, but there were so many other things that we wanted to discuss, which was, of course, the new technology and how that's affecting. Perhaps we can jump to that and talk about, this AI and how now the design industry in the past 2-3 years is in a topsy-turvy situation and everybody's excited with all these tools that have come in. How does that, in your mind, affect, influence this whole concept of vernacular design? What do you think it will do to the spaces that you are creating or imagining? Sandeep?
I've got mixed feelings about it, but I mean, look, as most designers would, but I won't talk about AI, but I talk about computational kind of tools, which enable you to, do parametric design. You've got Rhino, Grasshopper, softwares, which are now being taught in a lot of the good schools in India. I think there are vast possibilities there. And I'm quite encouraged. Like, we were recently in Bali, and we went to the Green School in Bali, and we saw, and I see in the area of bamboo construction, that's vernacular construction of a region, it's unbelievable the forms that one can kind of imagine now with these computational programs. I mean, there was a building that we saw, which was the Arc, which is actually the tallest freestanding bamboo building in the world. 14 meters high, 19 meters wide, these arches, done in the most poetic way. And it was such an unbelievable mix between the architects, the local studio, Ibuku, the structural engineers who were sitting in London, and then the local carpenters who were used to building with bamboo because they know how bamboo is going to behave. And it was such an interesting meeting of minds when I actually just imagined how they went about it. Firstly, experiencing that building was something, but then when I read about it and I saw and I kind of understood how they went about with the software to be able to imagine those forms, and then the kind of interaction between all the stakeholders, it was extremely fascinating. And so today we are able to arrive at impossible forms. And I don't think you should arrive at those impossible forms just because you can. But if there is an end, if there is an exciting way in which you can work with the craftspeople, the carpenters, the builders, and use their kind of resources and expertise and combine it with, and the computer kind of, imagines a beautiful form also, then I think it's a win-win situation. Yeah.
I want to ask you as well.
I'm allowed to
but
speak?
Yes, just briefly, please.
It's read there already. Just a quick one. I think through the AI and the computation, the processing, the production of printers and so on and so forth, there would be twofold impact globally, of course, much quicker than in India because of the diversity in this country. So one is certainly the designer who gets impacted by it. The designer has, I call it, the AI is my mentor, a senior mentor. If I would be a student in architecture, my professor would have been the mentor who knew more, faster, concluded faster, understood things much faster than I do. To some extent, the AI is actually my new mentor, who is smarter. There's no doubt when it comes to rationalization, rational processes about computation, it's much quicker. That's one relationship. The other relationship is actually between the architect using this tool and people for whom he's designing or developing a design or a building. There is a major change going to happen. And I think that cuts across globally. Because of this speed in computation and the possibilities of options that it can throw at you. I tried to put my hand on this AI recently for a high-rise building in Bombay. It was magical to see in a quick time through using your language how much you can manipulate the design. So suddenly I think, and clients of course will understand it very quickly, that you can create options very quickly. That means architecture and design will more and more get into becoming a commodity. So it is you are going into a shop. It is already a bit like that. The catalogs that are available, mostly they are of past buildings. What about you have future building catalogs that are now available to people? So you go to the architect's office studio, you say you want this one. So I think it is happening to art also. I want to pick up the art. I'm not a part of the art, but I collect it. So architecture becomes a collection of these probably iconic enterprises. I think that's going to happen.
No, that's very interesting. I want to talk to you about this so much more, but I think we have our next session. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So nice to have this conversation.
Thank you so much.